get switched over here so that we can get started. Let's see, is the correct screen showing, Ashley and Dawn?
Tiffany, you are in presenter mode.
Yep.
Great. That's what I was afraid of. I think I accidentally clicked the wrong one because it wasn't loading. There we go. I think we're set now. So we are ready to begin. I'm going to turn it over to Ashley.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. We are so glad that you could join us today. We're talking about differentiating instruction in the post-pandemic classroom. And so I know that this is a pertinent conversation and a topic for a lot of us as we are going to begin the fall semester. So I just want to welcome you. My name is Ashley Moore. I'm the Director of Gifted and Talented Education here at the State Department of Education.
And I'm Tiffany Neal. I have the pleasure of serving as the Deputy Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction. And as I mentioned in the chat, we're so thrilled to have you with us today. We have a lot of engagement planned and a lot of resources to share, but we hope that you will utilize the chat box pretty actively, and it appears you already are. So Ashley's going to set us up with a few just housekeeping items.
Great, thank you. So if you haven't already, go ahead and find the little participant usually it's at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and then click next to your name over the more and click rename, and you can rename yourself. We would love for you to go ahead and include your district so that we know where you are and where you're coming to us from. You can also we'd also love if you would click the mute to maybe turn off your camera. You can do that by clicking the little microphone that says mute, and then the stop video will do that. That way it just allows, I think there's gonna be a lot of us on the chat today. We already have a bunch of people, so that just helps us to hear and participate better. If you need to use a participant reaction, you can do so by clicking the little smiley face that says reactions. It's still on that toolbar in Zoom. You can raise your hand. You can, if you like something, you can heart it. You can also throw confetti at us. So, and then as Dawn said in the chat, we have Dawn Irons, who is awesome, and she's our moderator today. So she's going to be watching that chat box and monitoring your participant reactions. So we're glad to have her with us today.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up, we do encourage you, we love to see faces on the screen if you're able to share, turn your video camera on, and we love to see participant reactions. That helps us along in the virtual setting. So thanks so much for being proactive there.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of you have already started doing this, but if you haven't, please go ahead in the chat box and list your name, your role, your district, and go ahead and tell us the first concert you remember going to help us get to know you just a little bit better.
Yeah, first concert is always really interesting. Sometimes it can indicate maybe which era you were in high school. Other times it just indicates that you had really cool parents who took you much younger than high school. We see some Alice Cooper, the Jackson 5. Oh, what a great concert that would have been. Yeah, I see a lot of reaction to that there. So we'll see New Kids on the Block. I have to say that was one of my favorite concerts, but I didn't get to go till I was adult. Actually, we see a few New Kids on the Block folks in here. Elton John, oh my goodness, Ginger, what a great first concert. Garth Brooks was my first concert in high school. How about you, Ashley? What was your first concert?
Someone else in the chat posted it, so I'm wondering if we're at the same concert, and it was Amy Grant.
Oh,
so my aunt and uncle took me when I was young, but that was my first comment. So I really appreciate that someone else in the chat had the same concert.
Yeah, I saw Sean Cassidy there too. How about you, Dawn? Or I'm sorry, Dawn. Yes, Dawn. What was your first concert, Dawn, as we're finishing up this particular chat question?
My first concert was Erykah Badu in Central Park when I was a college student.
And we see the Bee Gees showing up. Wonderful. So we're already fast musical friends, and so please continue to use the chat box pretty actively today, because we will leverage your responses to help us think through aspects of the session today.
Great. So as we work for this session today, we would love for you to stay muted if possible. That way we don't have any background noise interfering. Use the chat box for questions, comments. We are going to use that today, also to respond to some discussion as well. We'd love for you to be present and participate as much as you can because it helps us out and we want to hear from you. You can respond to any of the prompts in the chat box when you see the image, and you are welcome to show your video if you'd like to, so we can see your faces. We already have a page for resources and links from this presentation at this bit.ly link, so you are welcome to go and already see all of the resources and links provided. Our session objectives today, we're going to explore effective practices for differentiation, gain resources to support models of differentiation, and explore how it supports acceleration. So those are our 3 objectives today. And then again, if you want a link to the slide deck, you are welcome to click there and kind of follow along. So.
All right, so we're actually going to start today with a little different style of entry into our session than perhaps if you joined for yesterday's session on accelerated learning. Yesterday, we asked a question that really pertained to the topic of the session. Today, we're going to ask you to respond to this question, which we will reveal throughout the session today how your responses to this particular question will be leveraged to help us explore differentiated instruction and effective strategies. And I'm actually going to ask Ashley and Dawn to also engage in this question because we're going to leverage their responses a little bit later. I do want to say to everyone on the screen, with the exception of Ashley and Dawn, you won't be asked to share your response with anyone unless you so choose to at a specific point in the chat. So I hope that you feel free to really answer this question. So here's the question. On a scratch piece of paper, or if you're on your computer and you want to type it up, however best suits you, would you please take the next 3 to 4 minutes and explain how water from the shower fogs up a mirror? Now, Dawn and Ashley in particular, you can use drawings, you can use written explanation, you can use a combination of those things, as well as everyone else on the screen today. If you would, try to answer this question. And here's the trick. If you use any sciencey terms, now I know that's that can be a little challenging, but if you use any sciencey terms in your explanation, if you would go ahead and explain what that science term means in the context of how it helps to explain the fogged mirror. So what I mean by that is you can't just use a science term and then not explain it and how it is helping you explain why the mirror fogs up. So I'm going to start the music a little bit. We'll get a little more good music for the next 3 to 4 minutes. And if everyone will help us out by taking the time to respond to this question, it will allow us to really have some really nice experiences throughout the session today. As you're responding to this question, one thing I should have mentioned is that we're going to try to stay away from Ashley and Dawn Googling the answer. We're going to try to use our own background understanding and our experiences to help us explain what causes the shower to fog up the mirror. So we'll just take a couple of more minutes to explore that question and allow you to write down your responses, again, using drawings, written explanations, or a combination of both. So just a couple more minutes on that. Ashley, thanks so much. We appreciate that you're following the rules today. Thank you for not Googling. Just about one more minute. All right, and Ashley and Dawn, refrain from looking in the chat as some folks are already sharing some of their ideas.
They're trying to help me out.
Yeah, I can tell, yeah. All right, we will go ahead and start back up. Just hold on to those responses and we will, sorry about that, we will leverage them a little later in today's session. So the question we would like for you to answer to start us out on a good foot today with this session is related to the topic of the session. So if you'll take just the next minute or so and respond in the chat box to this question. When you think of differentiated instruction, what do you envision? What are students doing? What are teachers doing? And just take a moment to respond there in the chat box to this prompt for everyone who is able. When you think of differentiated instruction, what do you envision? What are students doing? What are teachers doing? This one requires a little bit of a longer answer, so I'm sure it's taking folks a little time to get in the chat box on this one. We see Kim says teachers working with groups of students. We see responses related to students working collaboratively together. So these are things that we're thinking about with differentiated instruction. We see students working on their grade level, authentic process learning, various, let's see, lots of answers coming in now. Students working at different tasks over the same learning goal, students working on their own pace. Wonderful, lots of really great responses. So hopefully that gets you started or in a good frame of mind for us to dig in and explore a little further related to this topic of differentiated instruction. So we're going to start today's session by really looking at what the research tells us about what differentiated instruction is not. And not only research, but teachers in the field who have really been working for a number of years to provide effective differentiation. So we'll just explore a few of these. So differentiated instruction is not individualized instruction or chaotic. Sometimes both of those ways of thinking can be termed as differentiated instruction, but that's not really what we're talking about with effective differentiated instruction. Really, it's more like a one-room classroom where teachers are working with the whole class, sometimes in small groups and sometimes with individuals to meet their needs. Also, the instruction is very purposeful. So if students are working on different tasks or projects in the classroom, and some may be working with the teacher and others may be working independently, there's always intentionality or purpose in the tasks that students are doing. It really is not disorderly or an undisciplined environment. Very structured by the teacher, even though students may be doing different things. It's also not just another way to provide homogeneous grouping. Really, differentiated instruction is about using flexible grouping, which accommodates students who are strong in some areas and weaker in others. So as an example of this, we might find that a student would be great with math skills and not as quick to grasp patterns in history. We also may see that students are quick with math word problems, but careless with computation, or that students may be great at interpreting literature, but not so strong in spelling. So they have both strengths and then some areas for building blocks or growth that they may need to be on grade level instruction. And those differences in the abilities or their foundational skills or building blocks may have nuances within a particular topic where they might be really strong in one area and a little weaker in another. We also see that differentiated instruction is not just tailoring the same suit of clothes. And here's what we mean by this. If the basic assignment itself that's being offered to students is far too easy for, let's say, a learner who is seen as advanced in that particular area, giving that student a chance to answer an additional set of complex questions that are really this, sort of at the same level of learning, or assigning more work, it's really not an adequate challenge for those students. On the flip side, if information is essential for a struggling learner, allowing them to skip a test question because they never understood the information, it really doesn't do much to address the student's learning gap. So that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about differentiated instruction. Actually, there are a couple of other things that really differentiated instruction are not, and I know you want to explore those.
Yes, thank you. Differentiated instruction is not just for outliers. I know that sometimes when we think about that term, maybe the students who immediately come to mind represent populations of students in those outliers. For example, students with identified learning challenges. We know that they need scaffolding on a regular basis. We know we will have students in our classrooms who have those identified learning challenges. We also know that students who learn rapidly, think deeply, or readily make meaningful connections, these can be gifted and talented students, but they may not have been identified for gifted and talented. They may need scaffolding. We know that. Students who are just learning the language spoken in the classroom, we also know they need interventions and scaffolding. But differentiated instruction is not just for those students. It is also for students who may struggle moderately. Sometimes students who know a good bit about a portion of a lesson or a unit, but they may struggle with maybe vocabulary or specific steps or content within what you're teaching. They also need differentiation. Students whose experiences really weigh negatively, and we know a lot of our students come to school for these supports, but sometimes that weighs negatively on their ability to engage or to concentrate or focus on what they're doing, or maybe even to complete work. And so differentiated instruction can help with that. Students who are just about to take flight, these students, they just need the extra encouragement, support, and boost to really launch. Like they're ready to go. And so that's where differentiated instruction can really step in and help these students to be successful. So we've looked at a variety of what differentiated is not. So what does that look like in a traditional classroom? If we look at a traditional classroom where there's not a lot of differentiated instruction, we may see a fixed physical environment, grade level resources where the same resources, assignments, time frame, all of that, there's a lot of same, right? So not this awareness necessarily for our differing students. Very teacher-led instruction, same starting place, and same summative assessments for all. So that's kind of what our traditional classroom would look like versus a differentiated classroom where we see a flexible physical environment. This might mean that student desks are moved a lot, kids are up and moving. It may seem a little bit noisier, but that doesn't mean it's not organized chaos. Variety of levels of resources being used, different assignments that may consider pace or challenge. Teacher is more of a facilitator or coach, and oftentimes these are student-led. Maybe you have student-led discussions or student-led activities. Pre-assessment makes the match, so there's a lot of focus on assessment and knowing where students are in their learning, and then varying assessments matching their learning experiences, knowing where these assessments show that students have gaps or maybe are missing pieces of information, and then matching that to their learning. So we've explored a lot about what differentiation is not. And now, to meet the needs of students, we're going to talk about what differentiated instruction is. So we're going to start with these 6. And so as we move through these 6 areas, we're going to give you examples and models for these. So differentiated instruction is proactive. It is rooted in assessment. It takes multiple approaches to content, process, and product. All 3 of those, not just one. It is student-centered. It is a blend of whole class, group, and individual instruction, which I saw someone comment in the chat box on that, so I appreciate that. And it is organic and dynamic, which I love because it is not just something that is started before school starts and then the plan is set for the year. It is constantly modifying and changing to meet those needs of our students in time. So we're going to start by talking about proactive. How is differentiated instruction proactive? In a classroom, so think about that classroom we talked about a moment ago, the teacher anticipates that learners have differing needs. Again, not just our outlier populations of students or learning challenges, but of all students. And so knowing that maybe we don't even know what those learning needs are yet. Proactively plans lessons that provide a variety of ways to get at and express learning, builds rapport with students through interest surveys to learn students' interests, strengths, and abilities. We know that knowing our students is important and building rapport is important, but it doesn't just stop there to be friends and to have them like us. It is a building so we understand who they are and what their background and experiences are, part of their culture, part of who they are, so that way we can build on those to engage them in their learning and have these authentic experiences. And that's the last bullet point there, provides appropriate challenge and authentic learning experiences to meet their needs. That's how we know that they're going to have the most academic growth, is when they can build on their culture, background, experiences. There's a link on that third bullet point to interest surveys. And I know that Tiffany's going to talk more about that. So,
yeah, and I think that many of us as classroom teachers, we have a sense of the assessments that give us information related to where students are academically with skills and content. And sometimes thinking about really strategic ways to understand students' backgrounds, their background experiences, to understand their interests and identity, to understand their culture, which is really related to the people and places that they surround themselves with on a daily basis. Getting at some of that information in a way that can really be leveraged for differentiation support in the academic setting can be a little challenging, or maybe we haven't seen as many examples of that because it hasn't been a priority. So as Ashley mentioned, the interest survey that's linked there is a good way to start out the beginning of the year and get some ideas related to what your students might be interested in and their backgrounds. But there are other ways that we can accomplish this sort of in the scope of planning for an upcoming unit or lesson. And here is an example of a strategy called self-documentation. You can see a link here on the screen, and it will also be in our resource document today. But here is a strategy that's being utilized prior to a unit on health with students. And the self-documentation activity asks, what are the things you and your family do to stay healthy and keep from getting sick? This particular self-documentation asks students to take pictures and then complete this chart of what is this picture? Where did you take the picture? What activity does this picture explain? And how does this activity help you stay healthy and or keep from getting sick? So you can see some of the explanations here by the student. And you get a sense of their culture and their background knowledge and their experiences as it relates to this topic. And when you start to get some of the pictures, you get further insights into the students' lives. So here we see Caitlin took a picture of the tea that her family drinks, and a little statement about why they think that this keeps them healthy. She also took pictures of some plants that are grown in their backyard that represent sort of the healthy food that they ingest. One of the funnier one of these that I've seen, and I know this is being recorded, so I hope it's okay to share with you all, but a student actually took a picture of their restroom, and in the explanation, they talked about how important it was to be healthy in that area, and that was a sign of health and well-being, and something that their families talked about. Or their family talked about. So you get insights into students' backgrounds, their experiences, their day-to-day lives, and how they are connecting maybe a topic or a learning experience in the classroom with things from their life outside of the classroom. And imagine how you can leverage some of these to show appreciation, for example, of Caitlin's family using the tea, or perhaps the healthy food. If you've got several students that are showcasing images of their garden, you can have students talking about, in the context of your lesson, what about that healthy food helps them stay well. So there are lots of ways to do this. There's one other strategy we don't have a link for, but you could also think about any context that you are going to set your lesson or unit in for any subject area: math, science, social studies, English language arts. And maybe you give a survey before you're going to plan out the unit or lesson, and you give different examples of the context that you might utilize, and ask students which context seems most interesting to them. Now, in many cases, you might think, well, I'll use the context that most or the majority of students pick in my classroom. But I would challenge you to consider selecting the context maybe for students who you've already identified as students that may not be ready for on-grade level learning for the content you're getting ready to introduce. Maybe you're strategically selecting the context for students who are receiving English learner supports, or students who are receiving special education supports, but giving students, or getting that sort of interest, what resonates with them in the way of the context that you might use, books that you might select, text that you might select, investigations you might do, can give you a really great way to engage your differentiated instruction, or set your differentiated instruction up to resonate with the interest and lives of students. So hopefully those are a couple of examples that resonated with you, and something you can take back and think about using in your classroom to be proactive about engaging students in differentiated instruction related to interest, identity, cultural backgrounds. Now, the second area we're going to focus on as a really central component of differentiated instruction, Ashley's mentioned this a couple of times already. Differentiated instruction is really rooted in having access to quality and ongoing formative assessments. And really formative assessments that allow you as a teacher to truly see what students are thinking, for students to be able to showcase their thinking in a variety of ways. So earlier with the fogged mirror example, I asked Ashley and Dawn and the rest of you to respond to that question using drawings, written explanations, or both. I didn't engage you in discussing it with me or with other peers, but that would be an option. And obviously you can see with an example like we see on the screen here, that when students are given a chance to showcase their learning, you can pick up on nuances in the way that students are thinking about the concept or skills that you're getting ready to introduce to them, maybe in ways that you couldn't get at with other types of assessments that don't allow you to see their thinking. Sometimes students may not have access to terms that we're looking for on some of our traditional assessments. And in this way, by drawing or written explanations or discussion, then I, as the teacher, can pick up on the conceptual part of their understanding, their explanations void of maybe some of the terminology, and I can really get a sense of where they're at with their understanding and skill set. So let me ask you in the chat box, based on the fogged mirror example, what might I learn as a teacher from your explanation as to how water causes a mirror to fog? If you'll add in the chat box, think about what you wrote down. If I were to view that as a teacher, what might I learn from your explanation? Or in general, you can think about other people on the line today. If I were looking at those explanations, what would I learn as a teacher? Erica says I would learn prior knowledge, misconceptions, vocabulary they know. They may not have a lot of science terms, but they might have some strong conceptual understandings. You know, one thing that's interesting about this type of assessment is I tend to also find out from students aspects about their lives. So here's the thing. What if students have never had in their homes a shower and they've had a bathtub? What if students are giving specific examples in their explanations of times where they've seen this? As you can imagine, I can get a lot of their background experiences. And if I had used a different form of assessment, all of the wonderful things that you're sharing in the chat box, I might have missed out on those opportunities just because the assessment style didn't give me an opportunity to see the student thinking. Wonderful responses in the chat box, by the way. Thank you so much. So here's an example actually of a student response to this question. And you can see for me as a teacher, from the drawing, I get a sense that the student believes that gas is involved between water from the shower and water on the mirror. So they know that there's some sort of connection, and I can see that from the arrows that are going from the shower to the mirror. I also see through their explanation that the student believes that water sticks to cold surfaces, and that evaporation is water sticking to cold surfaces. So now I can see that that student doesn't really have a concept that the form of water or the state of water is changing. For this student, they believe the water is moving and sticking to the mirror. And I could probably see from this assessment form that there are several students that have that as a way that they're thinking about why this occurs. So I can begin to probably think at this point of this, how I might do some student grouping for instruction based on some commonalities between their thinking in their explanation. Now, one thing we always like to point out when it comes to formative assessments is this little saying, which is a saying that I heard from someone at a presentation a few years ago, and it's just stuck with me as a teacher for about 10 years now. So the question asked by that presenter was, what if we have misconceptions about misconceptions? And I thought that was an interesting question, because what he really meant was, what if we really thought of student thinking as purposeful building blocks? And some students have a certain set of building blocks and others don't, but they're all building blocks where we can help students add to their understanding. How might that make me as a teacher think differently about the assessments like this that I'm reviewing? I think what it might allow me to do is to take a stance of generous interpretation of the students' responses. And what I mean by that is, rather than looking at their response and thinking about all of the misconceptions I'm somehow going to have to fix as a teacher, which, by the way, it's not about us fixing, right? It's about the students having more experiences and learning opportunities so that they can have new understandings and make sense of things more, or change the way they think about something. And so as a teacher, if I look at this generously, and I think that now we're just going to build on what the student has, perhaps it takes some of that anxiety away from me as a teacher and feeling like, I almost get my shoulders up, Ashley and Don, where I'm like, oh, I got to fix all of this. But rather it's about, what are the experiences we're going to provide students so they can add to their understandings or rethink their understandings. So here's another example of a formative assessment. This one's in math. And here we see when students are responding to this question, they're being asked, is this a correct answer? Yes or no, or a correct version or way of thinking about this math problem. And then on the right, students are asked to explain their thinking. So see, we can use even some of our traditional assessments that we have access to. And just by adding the section of explain your thinking, we can really get at the nuances of how students are understanding a concept or their abilities with skills. And here I can see that these two students, that they are organizing prime factors using factor trees. So that gives me a sense of their understanding of prime factors. Whereas students who are answering similarly in this way, these two students, what I really see is that they're relying on simplifying, and they're choosing yes or no based on the solution without regard to prime factorization, which probably means they don't have access to that building block. And that gives me a lot of information as I think about differentiation. So many people ask, where do you find assessments like these? Now, the two examples we showcased are from math or science, and there are a lot of examples of these types of formative assessment probes in the math or science world, and they're linked here. But as you can imagine, even in an English classroom, if you have students who are reading a text and you are asking them to respond to some comprehension questions, if you're giving them an opportunity to respond with their words, with drawings, with a combination of those things, you're probably getting some good insights into students' skill sets with English. And one thing we are excited to share with you is coming up next year from our Director of Social Studies Education, Brenda Beamer Chapman. She is working with a group of teachers to develop these type of formative assessment probes for social studies. And those will be available in the spring or summer of next year. All right, Ashley, let's keep moving forward with what else is something we should be doing with effective differentiated instruction.
Thank you. Very good. So we've gone through 2 bullet points already. So number 3, taking multiple approaches to content, process, and product. So we're going to spend some time talking about all 3 of these areas. But just as an overview, when we talk about content and differentiating instruction for content, what the question really is, what do I want students to know? You know, we think about the standards, we think about what the grade level standards and content is, and then what do I want them or need them to know about that? And so we can consider possibly where are the gaps, where might this be, what's the prerequisites or the prior knowledge they need to understand before they can get there. But it's really focusing on what's that content, what I want students to know. When we look at process, it's not just the content and the standards, but it's how can I use strategies to allow students different sense-making opportunities. So taking that content and then how are students going to engage in that through what strategies so that they can make sense of their learning and what they're learning so that we see that academic growth. And then product. How can I have students demonstrate what they've learned? So what are some differentiation strategies for product? How can they, or what are the different ways that they can demonstrate that? So we'll talk about all 3 of these, but you'll notice at the bottom, this assessment, and we've mentioned it multiple times, that assessment really permeates all 3 of these areas, that there's this constant assessing students and where they are, whether it's with the content, whether it's as they are partaking in their learning in the process, or even in the product when they turn in whatever the assignment or task is, that we're looking at that all throughout. And so we're going to start by talking about content. So we'll start there and we'll talk about content and some strategies and models to support differentiated instruction within content. Oh, Tiffany, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
I did that. I did hit mute for a little bit. So as Ashley said, we first want to start when we're thinking about planning for differentiated instruction. We really want to think about the content or what we want students to know or the skills we want them to build. And as a teacher, as Ashley mentioned, the first place we want to start is with our grade level standards. Now, if you haven't seen the Oklahoma curriculum frameworks yet, they've been around for a few years, and what they provide, I'm actually gonna take us here so you get a chance to see what one of these curriculum frameworks looks like. Well, just a moment, I will get there. The minute you go off screen and it freezes, it makes for a little bit of a challenging time, but we are almost there. All right, I think we're there now. Sorry about that, everyone. So you can go to the State Department website and find the Oklahoma curriculum frameworks. It's also linked in our resources today, and I'm sure Dawn is also sharing it in the chat. But we'll take a look at the math curriculum frameworks. So if we go here and we go to any grade level, let's just say 2nd grade. What you can see here for each of the curriculum frameworks is an area titled objective analysis. It has a full list of the standards and the objectives for a particular content area. And if you click on one of those standards or objectives, then you're going to get information about what that standard or objective means, sort of in a nutshell or in lay terms. You'll also get a sense of what students are doing if they're showing that they're working towards proficiency, what teachers are doing to support students towards working to those proficiencies. You'll get key understandings or takeaways related to that objective or standard, and then common misconceptions that at that grade level, teachers would want to think about helping students address or rethink their understanding there. So again, this level of support is there for every standard, for every objective, for our standards for math, English language arts, science, and social studies. And fine arts is also available and will be on this website very soon. We're working to build physical education and health, computer science, world languages, and really the sky's the limit after that, I think, for other areas teachers are interested in. But imagine for me as a teacher, the work that I might do individually in trying to unpack a standard or an objective to really understand what the intent of it is for students. So I can think about what is it I want students to know or be able to do as I'm planning my lesson and really thinking about differentiated instruction. Essentially, that work has been done here by groups of teachers, expert teachers across the state in Oklahoma. So it's a really wonderful resource to help you think about that content piece that Ashley was talking about. And again, just to show that I'm not fibbing about this, if we go to the social studies standards and we go to 4th grade, objective analysis, we go to a standard and we see the same level of support there as well. Now, the other great thing is that also in the curriculum frameworks, you'll find, in addition to that unpacking, you'll find instructional strategies and resources that really support some of the aspects of differentiated instruction that we're talking about today. So we see here for social studies, lesson ideas, inquiry tasks, and many of them have some of the instructional strategies we'll talk about embedded in those resources. So lots of support. If you haven't gone to the Oklahoma curriculum frameworks, obviously we're big advocates for that. And it just showcases the expertise of teachers in our state that they were able to develop such wonderful resources. So in addition to those curriculum frameworks, one thing we also have available for teachers to help them think about how to think about the content that students will be prepared for in your lesson or activity. We have these progression documents for each of our subject areas, which provide you a glimpse as to what the learning objectives or standards are for students prior to the grade level that you're teaching. So as you can imagine here for English language arts, it can really give you a sense if you start to see where students are falling out in their abilities or conceptual understanding. It'll give you some idea as to where that expectation is in the grade level for the standards. So these are available for the new English language arts standards that were just passed in May, and these are wonderful documents if you haven't seen them. We also have them available for social studies, for mathematics. And then I'm going to take us back to the fogged mirror example and see how this can really be used by the teacher as you're thinking about differentiated instruction and the content that you're preparing your lesson or activities around. So here, remember, we're trying to figure out if students can explain what causes a mirror to fog up. So if we go to the progression document for science, here we see in grades K through 2, students are gaining an understanding that matter exists, and many of them, and that matter exists in solid or liquid form depending on temperature. We see in grades 3 through 5 that students can start showing that gases are made from matter particles that are too small to be seen. And both of those concepts serve as building blocks for explaining why the water from the shower leads to fogging of the mirror. So if I'm thinking about the ways in which my students are coming into my class with that formative assessment of the fogged mirror and what their understandings are. For example, the student who felt that the water stuck to the mirror, I could probably say that they don't yet have an understanding of this concept in grade 3 through 5. I know that's an area that I'm going to have to go to have to figure out through differentiation how I support a group of students in gaining that concept so they are prepared for the grade level learning experience, or so that they can gain something from the grade level learning experience. But the progression documents can really give you a sense of how these concepts or skills progress over time and really inform us as teachers as we're thinking about differentiation. So we would highly encourage you to access those progression documents as well. They're extremely fruitful. All right, the second step here, Ashley, process.
Great, thank you. So we talked about earlier the process that we're going to talk about strategy. So now we've talked about content and what it is we are teaching. Now, how are we going to engage students in their learning? And so we're going to talk about just a few what we're going to call sense-making strategies. We're going to go to the next slide if that's okay, Tiffany. Thank you. So we're going to talk about learning centers and stations, flexible grouping and tiered activities, peer and small group discourse, and a Frayer model. Are these all of the sense-making strategies out there? No, there are so many more, but we're going to specifically kind of dive into these and talk about what they do and how we can use them to differentiate for students in our classroom to meet their learning needs. So we're going to start by talking about learning centers and stations, and we're going to watch a short video. As we watch the video, I want you to keep a question in your mind, and then we will respond in the chat box. How can learning centers or stations support the various learning needs of students? And I know some of you may be familiar with stations or centers, but I want you to watch the video kind of with a new eye with differentiation as you do so. So I think Tiffany's going to play that for us.
Yep, and I'm just switching screens here so we can do that, and making sure that the volume is turned up so everyone can hear it.
Look at all these great volunteers. Go ahead. Yes, nice job. So the impact of differentiation, the students feel successful. They feel supported. They know if something is difficult for them, there's something that's a little more in line with their strengths coming up soon. So it really makes education fun and approachable. I really think it's the most effective way that I have seen to teach.
The vision and the mission of Highlander is to use innovative practice as a social catalyst. We want our kids to be able to do anything any other kid from Providence could do.
We use differentiation all across the curriculum here at Highlander, and especially in the first grade. Although the content is the same, having the stations really allows me to tailor my lessons to each individual group of learners. So how the differentiation looks in my classroom, we start off with a whole group lesson. So let's get our reading glasses on. Let's get the letter part of our brains activated. This section of our curriculum, we have been looking at nonfiction texts. When we're looking at our book today, we're going to be thinking about where we can get information. And then in the phonics realm, we focused on contractions. We're taking two words, and what are we sticking them together with? Apostrophe. Yes, Karen. And then we break off into our small groups. So our yellow group is still learning how to do a lot of our literacy things. The green group is doing pretty well, but has a few things to work on still. And our blue group is hitting all the first grade standards and needs to be stretched. So our differentiation kind of takes two forms. The first is by student grouping, and the second is by modality of learning. We have 20 minutes per station, and there are 3 of the stations. The students will rotate through all 3 stations each day.
So our first station for the blue group is the computer station.
The students use a Google form to check in. They'll normally watch a video or carefully observe a photograph and answer some questions about that.
We watched a video about how to grow a seed. We had to type in our favorite part and why.
After they finish that form, they can check out an ebook.
And then you could do this game of reading called Teacher Must Know How to Read.
We're delivering things in a way that is visual, that is auditory, that is individual to the students through the technology.
After that, she rings the bell.
Clean up, switch up, first grade readers.
we switch to the sort station.
Our sort station is more of a physical modality. They're using their bodies, which is so important for first graders. They need to move. Kids are cutting out the words, they're gluing them down.
We had a contrasting game. It's fun because it's all mixed up and you had to find the right pieces. And then after we do that, we do rainbow writing.
That's another way that we differentiate. If students are able to get through more work, then they have some freedom of choice. Clean it up, switch it up. The last station, we're talking to each other and learning from each other. So that's more of the social interaction type of modality.
I like the teacher station the most because we get to view Miss Gallagher and we get to learn cool stuff.
So take a look at the illustrations on this page, right? And the content is the same, but it can be differentiated in a number of ways. My blue group, for example, they know what text is. They know what illustrations are. And so for them, I create a Venn diagram.
You need to make one circle like this, and then you make another circle overlapping.
Oh, for the yellow or the green group, I'm just leaving the Venn diagram out of it. We're still doing essentially the same thing, but just that piece that might be confusing to some of those students, I just leave that out for a later time. They'll get to it. All right, so clean up and meet me in the middle of the rug for writing. Nice work, first grade.
Being able to move through those stations, it's just another level of helping the students learn as much as they can each year. They really feel excited when they make that growth.
They're proud of themselves. They feel like they're effective learners. As a teacher, honestly, it is a lot of work, but the results that you see and the happy faces of the kids and the good feeling that you have in the classroom is worth it.
And while you're waiting, Tiffany, to bring up your slides, I just wanted to highlight a comment from Bethany in the chat. And she is encouraging all of her middle and secondary age teachers to embrace stations or centers because she's found that even those older students find benefit in that learning structure. And Tiffany,
Wonderful,
you
thanks.
are currently in presenter mode.
Oh, well, I did it again. All right.
So thank you for adding your thoughts to the chat. And if you have any questions, please make sure to put those in the chat and we'll be sure to surface some of those.
Yeah, I love the comments in the chat. And even if you have examples of how you've utilized learning stations in a high school setting or middle school setting, that would be great to hear in here. Ashley, are you facilitating our discussion here? I think?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I forgot I was on mute. So thank you. So if you can see the question again, how can learning centers or stations support the various learning needs of students? Go ahead and respond to that in the chat box. We love your ideas. Thank you, Bethany and Dawn, for sharing that. As a high school teacher, I agree. Stations and centers can be done at the middle school, junior, and high school level. So that may be a bit of a challenge just in your thinking about how that works and moving around a classroom with bigger bodies, but it is definitely worth doing. And if you need help, I bet there's some people with resources out there and ways that this can look in different subject areas for sure. So yeah, sixth grade science, that's a great one. Thank you.
Yeah, I see high school Spanish from Katie. And Katie says she called it, Katie, you may have to unmute as that Spanish was not the course that I took in language in high school. So
this is viajando. It just means traveling. So I wanted to make it a little less like little kiddish and more, you know, for the kids of that age.
Wonderful. And Katie, when you did the stations, what were some of the things you noticed with students that were different than if you had lessons where you didn't do stations?
That's a good question. There are some learners who don't like it. They just want to stay in one spot and put their head on the desk, but that's high school for you. But some kids really, really enjoyed. And this way I was able to do more tactile things like sorting things sorting words into different categories or matching them to English. So I was just able to do more without having to make a set for the entire class of the things
Wonderful,
I was doing.
wonderful. Thanks for sharing that impromptu today with us. We always love hearing from the field. You know, I shared yesterday with some folks that my background experience in teaching, I was a science and an English teacher. I started at an alternative school for middle school and high school students. So I taught 6th through 12th grade, and really doing the stations was an essential part of the way that we were able to conduct learning experiences, because we might have a student who technically by age would have been, let's say, a junior, but they were in a classroom sometimes with students that were 8th grade students. And so really setting up the stations was super helpful in that way. We see a lot of wonderful examples of stations. So it sounds like we have some believers, Ashley, on stations and their effectiveness for differentiated instruction.
I will say at the high school level, I was an English teacher. So I tried this once with a novel study. So at different stations, after we'd finished a novel, doing different elements. I think someone even mentioned that in the chat box about characterization, plot, setting, conflict, but you can even get into, you know, themes and stuff at different stations are representative of different elements of a novel study. And so the thing I like about learning centers or stations is that students are so engaged in what they're doing. They don't know what's happening at other stations, and everyone's going to be moving. And if a teacher is stationed at one, that's when you can really differentiate. So not only access different types of learning, kinesthetic, auditory, visual, whatever it may be, but and it gets them up and moving, which especially at secondary doesn't happen as much. So it really has a lot of good benefits for our students. So something to think about. Thank you for those who shared, and thank you for those who are continuing to add to our chat box.
Yeah, and Ashley, I think just really quickly, Heidi has a great strategy as well before we move on. And she mentions that students may have struggled with instructions at the station, the written instructions. So providing photos that served as instructions or short little video tutorials can be helpful as well.
That's a great idea. That's a great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Heidi. Appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to talk about, again, we're still in our process and our sense making, and we're going to talk about flexible grouping and tiered activities together. They are different, but we're going to talk about how they kind of relate to each other. We saw this a little bit in the video with flexible grouping. So flexible grouping is part of differentiation. But we want to understand it well. What it does is it places students into temporary groups for learning experiences based on student interest, readiness, and ability. So for example, the teacher in the video placed the students into groups based on like yellow, green, or blue groups. So they were not numbered, they were not high, medium, low. And honestly, students probably didn't even know what group they're going to. They were just like, today I'm in the blue group. Tomorrow they may be in the green group. So the color groups are really for the teacher knowledge. The students would never stay in the same group. They would never, that's flexible grouping is going to be continually changing. Therefore, we're not worried about the stigma that's attached or tracking or things like that that might be a detriment to students, and we want to avoid. But based on flexible grouping and how we do that, that's why this is so important that we have these teacher evaluated formative assessment that's in that first bullet point to really gauge the interest and ability of our students. That's why we talked about at the beginning with our interest inventories and those kinds of things. That really makes a difference in how we set these flexible groups up. Based on the flexible groups, then we can have these tiered activities as needed. So we can provide students choice and voice through various tasks that are different, that are challenging appropriately for the different student groups, and that can still provide authentic experiences for all of them. So let me give you a couple of examples that I know of. So for example, you could be reading, and I was an English teacher, so English teacher examples come easier for me. But if you read a novel, you could have 3 different themes from a novel. And so 3 different groups could be working with 3 different themes. They just think, oh, I have a different theme that I'm studying with my group compared to the other 2 groups. But the tasks associated could be very different. Again, still on, one could be more on grade level, one could be more a little bit above grade level, and then you have one that's much more advanced. Another example I saw from a district was about recycled art projects. So that's what their theme was. And everyone was doing some kind of recycled art project. but how that looks could be very different. You could have students making something from recycled materials, or you could have students just finding collage, like making a collage. You could have them actually painting something. So how what you're actually having them do in the task could be very different based on their abilities or their interests or their readiness. So to highlight some of these 3 bullet points on the right, again, teacher evaluated, formative assessment becomes critical, and how flexible grouping or the tiered activities are presented to students and how they're developed. They do ensure that all students receive appropriate challenge. So again, we're not treating all students the same. And then we want to make sure, if we're doing flexible grouping, that they always are changing. We don't have a student who's always in the yellow group with the same group of students, because students are smart. They know, oh, that's a smart group, or that's the not so smart group. And so we don't want that. We want to make sure that we're modifying that constantly. So students really don't know. They have no idea what group they're placed in or why. And maybe it's based on their interests. Students who are really into space, maybe they're in a group because they're reading something about space or doing something with science on space. So we'll go on to the next slide, which talks about a tiered lesson. So it gives an example of a tiered lesson. This is from language arts in a 4th grade classroom. You'll notice that group 1 is really based more on the standard, which is knowledge and comprehension, reading comprehension. And so these tasks for group 1, again, they're not below grade level. The teacher could include differentiation or strategies if there are students who have gaps in their knowledge or misconceptions that need to be fixed or worked on. But then group 2, you'll see that it focuses on analysis, and then group 3, synthesis and evaluation. So we have this tiered approach to what students can do with the text that is still encouraging the standard, and yet making accommodations or modifications based on the learning needs of the student. So it's one way this tiered lesson can work. Students don't necessarily know, but they have appropriate challenge for them. So, okay, I think we're going to talk about discourse now.
Yeah, so Ashley has given us some great examples of ways to differentiate through the process of learning, setting students up for sense making, whether it's through the learning stations, tiered lesson support, or flexible grouping. We also wanted to talk about the power of discourse to support sense making and differentiation in general. And so we're going to go back to our fogged mirror example. And this is where I'm going to ask Ashley and Dawn to do a little bit of a rehearsal for us, mirroring what students might be doing if they were given a chance to talk through or have discourse about the way they think about what causes a mirror to fog up in a bathroom if the shower is going. And so in just a moment, I'm going to ask each of them to read out their explanations and try really hard to read it as is and not modify because they're worried about grammar or maybe sounding silly, because that's not the case. We want to make sure they both understand that this is a safe environment where we all have some understanding or background that we can bring to the table, and that will help us all maybe come to a better understanding of what causes this to happen. And so as they're sharing their responses, I would like for each of them to do a little bit of active listening. And I've got a strategy here, which I hope will support them do that. Not that they wouldn't be actively listening to one another anyway, but as you are in the role of listener, if you would use this strategy to listen with. So I want you to underline anything that is similar to your own original explanation. So Ashley, if you hear something Dawn says that's similar to yours, if you'll underline it, and vice versa. If, however, you have differences, please circle those differences. And if you hear something that the other person says that's a statement or a way of thinking that you really appreciate and you want to incorporate into your explanation and maybe change it up, just put a plus sign with a note about that. And that's how we'll try to actively listen today. So would either of you be willing to volunteer and share your explanation?
Sure, I don't mind taking a leap. I actually am a big fan of diagrams and drawings, so I utilize that strategy. So I'm going to try, and with my background, might not be able to get great.
Yeah, I think it's because of the background being on. It covers up your sticky.
Let me try now. Is that better?
Yeah.
What I have drawn for you is a bathroom, and you can see over here I've got my shower. And it's important to note that everything in the rest of the bathroom, all of the fixtures, the air is going to be colder because I'm taking a hot shower. So my hot water comes out, and one of the things that I remember is that I think hot water molecules, as they're being heated, they begin to move around more. They dance around, and that helps fuel that change from water liquid state to gas. So as my hot water particles are moving and dancing around, they're moving over to the colder parts of the bathroom, and they're getting ready to change into that gas, that steam. But sometimes when some of those molecules maybe come into contact with some of those colder fixtures, the mirror being one of those colder fixtures, it will stop the process of converting the water into gas, and it will cool that potential steam back down, and it will remain water that will rest on, the mirror, the fixtures, etc. So that is my little description of what I think is happening.
Thank you, Dawn, very much for that. And Ashley, I'm sure you have questions, but before you ask questions, if you will go ahead and share some of your explanation for what may be causing this.
I did not draw a picture, so I wrote add picture. So thank you, Dawn. Okay, so I said it's colder outside of the shower, and the heat of the shower makes the water droplets that come out appear as steam, and when they hit the mirror or the glass door that's cold, they turn back into water. And I put a star and wrote difference in temperature, like that was important. So that's what I did. So
wonderful. And then maybe for the both of you, if you would reflect just a little bit, what do you see as things that are similar between your explanations?
I had underlined that when I was listening to Dawn, the colder outside and the heat of the shower, because I was thinking the same thing. And I use water droplets instead of molecules though, so.
Wonderful.
So I also noted and underlined that both Ashley and I were cognizant of the difference in temperature, warmer in the shower, colder the rest of the bathroom. We also referenced this idea of the liquid turning into steam, and then some of the water droplets being cooled by the mirror and other fixtures. So we had some similarities there. I think some of the differences that I noted, we used some different terminology. As Ashley said, I used particles, molecules, some sciencey words, if you will, and she used some different words to convey this.
She did not use sciencey terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do either of you feel like there are things you want to add to your explanation based on hearing the other person, or things that came to mind as you were listening to the other person?
Well, I think one thing that I might have included in my explanation that I didn't hear in Ashley, so she may want to add it if it's correct, I'm not sure. The part about how temperature creates molecules, water molecules to change state. So I think it's because the heat of the water causes the molecules to move faster and to separate more. I did have that idea conveyed, and I don't know if that was conveyed in Ashley. So that might be something for us to talk about, and maybe something for us to,
Sure.
think on more.
Well,
So that's
go
a good, sorry, I was gonna say, that's a really good point, because I wrote that down and I circled it, but I circled it because I wrote a question mark, like, I know this as in, like, I remembered as you said it. Yeah, I remember something moves more, but I couldn't really remember why. So I wanted to know more about it. So yeah.
So I'll let you guys off of the hot seat, so to speak. Thank you so much for being brave. Obviously, we wouldn't have 2 students do this in a space with hundreds of people. We were using it as an example and rehearsal for our professional learning purposes today. But we could see that students might be able to group up and do this, or as a teacher, maybe I'm strategically grouping students up to support them in this way. But my real question for you on the Zoom call today is, how does this idea of discourse and the example you saw between Dawn and Ashley, how can the discourse really support students with sense making? How can having conversations like this really help students make sense of whatever it is we are trying to learn together today? How does this talk or discourse really support sense making? What have you found, or what did you notice in this example? If you'll share that in the chat box, even though I don't have a prompt for that, we would really appreciate hearing your thoughts. How does the discourse support sense making? Sometimes one person can change another's perception. How might discourse support sense making? They hear things in layman's terms, the way their peers think. I can confirm my thinking. Makes me not feel dumb about a topic. Thank you so much for that. They can bounce ideas off of each other. I encourage you, the next time you use discourse in your classroom for this purpose of sense making through flexible grouping, peer interactions, really look at students and watch for this specific purpose. Watch for sense making. Watch how the discourse allows them to make sense. Because here's what brain research really tells us. It tells us that when we move from the step of just thinking about things, and we move to either writing them down or speaking them out loud, what's happening in our brains is organization and connection. And what's really happening is that we have to make sense of it ourselves before we show it externally on paper or we verbalize it through talk. And then the other thing that brain research tells us is that when someone else is explaining something and we're thinking about how that explanation compares to what we're already thinking, we are making these connections that I had Ashley and Dawn do, but we're doing it naturally. We're thinking about what's similar. We're thinking about what's different. And sometimes that difference that students are hearing, you'll see them sort of grimace even on their faces, because what that really means is they're saying that doesn't make sense with my own understanding. You'll see on their faces the head nodding, and that's usually meaning that they're in agreement, or, oh, that's something new that I hadn't thought about. And that is really how we incorporate new learning, is through this sense-making opportunity. And discourse can really, really support that. So you saw an example of a strategy we used for active listening and supporting sense-making through talk, but we wanted to share several other strategies with you, including this video, which we won't have time to listen to today, but it's in the presentation. It's an example in a classroom of students leveraging talk moves or support structures for conversations. And really what we find is when students have these support structures, it really helps them sort of stay on topic with the skills and the learning that you want for students to be engaged in. Oftentimes, when students are not staying focused in their discussions on the topic at hand, it can be because they don't have the proper supports to feel like they can have that discussion. And hopefully what you saw here in our example is that we gave students a little bit of prompting and support, and helping them see that, hey, we're all going to have things we want to add to our explanations. Probably we're going to have similarities, we're going to have some differences, and hopefully that frees them up to want to have open discourse about the topic at hand. But there are other great resources. And if you were with us yesterday, I showcased this resource as well. So I'm just going to touch upon it again. This particular resource is a brief on how to foster curiosity and learning in the classroom. Now, it is coming from the Math and Science Institute, but I promise you the strategies embedded in this resource are really applicable to all subject areas and courses. It's not specific to science or math. And what they provided in this wonderful resource tool is a flow diagram for Science Talk strategies. So here in the flow diagram, the first thing I want to think about as a teacher is, what is my purpose for the talk activity I'm going to engage students in? If I determine it's to get students to explain their thinking, then in the flow diagram, it tells me next to think about where in the unit or lesson I want to embed this Science Talk activity. Is it at the beginning, the middle, or the end? If it's at the beginning, then I'm going to use the share trade strategy. And when I click on that link, it gives me a description of this strategy and how to use it in my classroom. However, if it was the end of the class, maybe I want to use the strategy of claims and pass. Again, if I clicked there, I could see the full strategy with support resources to implement that in my classroom. So it really gives you a sense of, there are strategies that serve different purposes depending on what you're using the talk strategy for and where you're using it in the lesson. So we hope this is a wonderful resource that you will utilize. You'll also see in the slide deck another set of resources for science discourse to support students. You'll see a set of prompting cards here. Now, these are cards that can just be placed on tables for students. So when they're in the middle of discourse, they can use these question stems to keep the conversation going. There are also conversation starters. And there's a resource for pre and post talk writing. So it gives students a chance to write their thoughts first, and a strategy for being prepared for the discourse with their peers, and an opportunity to reflect on the discourse they just had with their peers. So lots of scaffolding here in these resources that are provided for Science Talk. We hope that you find those valuable. Now, science discourse is one of the process strategies that we're talking about today with sense making. Here is another that Ashley's going to tell us a little more about.
Thank you, Tiffany. So this can be used again as kind of part of a discourse strategy, but it's really, the work can be done individually or within groups or partners, however you decide to use it. But it's a Frayer model. And this is a generic template right here. We'll look at an example here in a moment, but this really asks students, if you choose a word or a term that you're teaching in your class, to define it. And I've seen this as their own definition versus like a dictionary or a more direct definition, listing the characteristics, finding examples of, and then the non-examples, what it is and what it isn't, to really kind of round out what this term or this word means. And this can be used in any subject area. So in the next slide, we'll see an example from math and from science. You'll see an example. The nice thing is you can have students draw. So the examples could be pictures. Sometimes, as you'll see in the example of the science, the visual illustration instead of maybe the facts or characteristics. So you actually can see them as they're talking about diffusion, maybe what this looks like. And then of course, examples and non-examples. You could also take this and do the same kind of thing that Dawn and I just did. Maybe they do this and then they meet together and have a discussion about. They could also work in groups to build these, to collaborate, to build their knowledge together. So I think this is a great way. You could also take this, and I've seen this used as well, for problem solving. So whether it's, a math, like word problem type that you want to put in here, and then you can have them, but it could be more for an inquiry-based lesson. What is a problem, or maybe an overarching question they want to solve? How do they understand it? Maybe as a group, they want to make a plan to solve this. Then what is the actual solution? And then how do they do that review and check? So kind of getting into some other areas of more critical thinking or problem solving would be a nice way that you could modify this to fit your needs of your students and what the unit is in your classroom, or the lesson in your classroom. So let's take another moment, and we're going to talk about product and get to product in the time that we have left. How can students demonstrate what they've learned? So now we've gone through content, we've talked about the process and the strategies to learn the material, and now we're going to get to, okay, now we think that they've learned this. What are they going to produce to demonstrate that understanding and knowledge? And so we're going to talk about a few strategies very quickly. I want to point out this Carol Ann Tomlinson quote. A synonym for product is authentic assessment. And I really like that. So when I think about product, my mind automatically goes to authentic assessment. Students can propose the way they'd like to show us something, or we might offer them two choices with the notion that they can make a deal with us to do the third one. This just helps us to know that there are multiple ways that students can demonstrate their understanding and knowledge of a topic. It doesn't just have to be one way, always summative assessment. And so we can offer these to students because the goal is to see what they've learned and how they've learned it. So a couple examples, tic-tac-toe. This is an example for obviously from English, but they would choose 3, so 1 from each row. So I could, make a diagonal. I can go make a column here, and they have the choice in it. Yes, this has been created, but they get the choice in which ones that they get to do. So again, there are some parameters, and yet they have that choice, which we know student choice makes a huge difference. Let's move to the next one. This would be like a learning or choice menu. So this is kind of a template, which is nice. So if you're creating this, you're like, what do I put in all these different boxes? So I like that this is shared here. So as I'm building one for whatever lesson, so maybe this at the end of a unit, and then students can, and it's up to you. You may say choose 2. You could do a kind of a tic-tac-toe board as well, or you could say choose 2, choose 3, whatever it may be. I think there's an example of it maybe on the next. So when you're building your learning or choice menus, these are some things to choose from as you're thinking about, wow, what do I have them do to produce to demonstrate their learning on this? It could be a debate. Obviously, it could be a written report or writing assignment. Maybe it's something they do with a partner or in a group, creating songs, poems, photo essay. Of course, there's with technology now and more access to computers. We have a lot of things that they have access to online, not just PowerPoint anymore. So, but providing these options, and it doesn't always have to be the same with every single unit, but when students have choice, then they can demonstrate their learning in a way that it interests them. So they're highly engaged in this, and then therefore they can show you the learning that's occurred. Just a great way to see that. At the bottom, this is linked here, an extension menu sample. So extension menu is more for our gifted and talented learners. However, a lot of our learners who have high interest and are fully and are engaged really like these extension menus as well. They're very same thing as choice menus, but she gives multiple examples from multiple different grade levels. So high school examples, middle school examples, elementary examples for different content areas that you can see what these actually look like. So it's a really good, I think it's 4 or 5 pages, maybe 6 pages long. So I recommend you, if you're interested in this and haven't done it before, to check out those examples and see how those might work in your curriculum or with a lesson or unit you're doing this fall or spring.
And we also,
I just wanted to, I know we're short on time, but Sarah has proposed an idea about relating the tic-tac-toe task to various DOK levels.
wonderful idea, wonderful suggestion. We are sharing a lot of resources today, but they're all really valuable as you think about, having your own choice menu of the strategies that you want to implement to determine products or process, or the formative assessment styles that you're using when you're thinking about content. So if you haven't seen the K20 Center at the University of Oklahoma, their Learn Strategies site, they have several strategies that they showcase in the way of these cards. And here we see choice boards show up. Frayer Models is on there, but also there are a slew of other strategies that can support differentiation and the different processes and formative assessments we've been talking about. When you go to the website, if you click on one of the strategy cards, it will flip. And on the back side, it gives you a full description of the strategy with resources. So we hope that's a good resource for you. And just if we go back to the fogged mirror, perhaps for that lesson or unit, at the end of it, I might actually use self-documentation as a way to have students do their final product by having them go home and find images of where water in gaseous form changes to liquid and explain how it is occurring in that setting. So that might be a really good way to give them choice and to connect with their home lives, and hopefully getting them to think about what they learned in class and how it connects to all the things that are going on around them in their lives. But that's just an example of a product that would give that level of support as well. So we'd love in the chat today, as we're getting ready to wrap up, if you would share with us how might differentiated instruction and the insights and strategies shared in today's session support students with unfinished learning they may have experienced due to disruptions during the 2021 school year. If you'll add your thoughts to the chat box, we'd love to see those. How would differentiated instruction and maybe some of the things that you gained today help you support students with unfinished learning that they may have experienced due to disruptions this last year? Any thoughts or ideas related to that, we'd love to see in the chat box. We see a response of it would give them more practice and reinforcement of those skills. Differentiation and some of the strategies we've shared can certainly do that. It can help build students' confidence. That might be something we really have to work on with several students this next year. Using formative assessments to get a good idea of where students are and where we may want to catch up. Extra time for understanding. Lots more about competition and reinforcement. Wonderful. And we see Sherry mentioned that the strategies would help students accelerate. So that actually leads us to where we want to kind of end our session today. And that is just briefly mentioning to you that we believe differentiation is a strong and effective strategy to support acceleration. Now, acceleration is a model for learning that is being touted certainly nationally and certainly by us at the State Department of Education as a strong way of thinking about how to implement structures that would support students with the unfinished learning that they may have experienced this last year. We may have several students coming to us that had disruptions at different points during their schooling last year. And so they may have some gaps that or some areas that they need to build upon to be ready for or engage in on grade level work. So what is acceleration? It's really a targeted intervention strategy providing students with extra time and support to address unfinished learning. And it is that just-in-time support to keep students learning on grade level rather than pulling them out or away from grade level instruction. It can occur outside or inside the school classroom. In yesterday's session, we focused a lot on acceleration time outside of the regular or on grade level classroom or core classroom. Today, we're hoping that the differentiation strategies you've seen here and the ways of thinking about differentiated instruction might help you or other teachers think about acceleration during the regular class time or the scope and sequence of the year. And so we're going to go back to the fogged mirror. I promise it's the last time we're going to be here, but we're going to play this out just quickly. For us as teachers, if we know we have a unit coming up or a lesson coming up that's going to focus on helping students understand this concept, we're going to start by really digging in and understanding what the learning goal is for students for the content, just as Ashley mentioned with the diagram, content, process, product. So here as a teacher, I would really dig in and understand what the lesson objective is related to my standards and use the curriculum frameworks to do that. I would use a formative assessment probe like the fogged mirror probe, maybe a week or two out from when I want to do the lesson or the unit. And I'll really analyze the student responses so I can prepare the levels of differentiation that I believe students will need to be successful during the unit or lesson. For process, once I'm ready to embark on instruction, I might leverage the strategy Ashley shared today, the learning stations, and several discourse strategies. So I might have 2 different investigation stations set up with different experiences for students to really get hands-on experiences with that water and temperature change. I might have 2 to 3 informational texts that I've strategically selected to provide different groups of students based on where I think they are at in their understanding. And then I might use the self-documentation as a product at the end to see how students have grown. So we are coming to the end of our session, and we wanted to share just a couple of last resources here that are specific to furthering understanding about acceleration and supporting students in the upcoming year. So if you haven't seen Ready Together yet from the other sessions you've been to, this is our statewide initiative to support schools, students, and families and communities in helping students address any of the disruptions they've had academically or socially, emotionally speaking. So there are a set of guidance documents and resources you can find here, just like this one on accelerated learning models. We encourage you to go there and check those out. We'll be adding to those over the next 3 years in particular. And then we're also providing a link to acceleration support documents that are provided through the Michigan State Department of Education. So last question, you're welcome to answer this in the chat, but we are at the end of our time together. So I think we'll kind of move on and just say, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to say to everyone, if you have some really good models of differentiated instruction, we saw those in the chat box, please email those to me, because in the coming year, we'd like to showcase some of those examples through videos, coming out to your school, getting a sense of how you do the differentiated instruction so we can share it with other teachers, or in guidance documents. So listen, if you shared a good strategy today, please email me so that we can reach out to you and share that wonderful expertise and knowledge with other teachers. Thank you so much for your time today. I know Dawn's going to put a link to the PD document if she hasn't already, but that's also found in our one resource document today. And Ashley, I just want to say you've been a great partner presenting today, and you have wonderful background on this topic. Thank you for sharing that. Again, we've appreciated you all so much. We're going to stay on just for a few minutes.
Thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you, thank you. And I know there was one person who asked about the PD certificate yesterday. Dawn is going to re-email that. And if you still are unable to get access to that, just email me directly at my email address. Thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and we look forward to seeing you in the school year next year. I guess we'll see what music is on, just so we end on a really good note.